Back to the time-consuming and perhaps totally useless practice of making YouTube videos. This time it'll have to be in short snippets because otherwise the technological limits of this phone are going to give me problems. So I wanted to make this video. We're marching towards the dictatorship of history, if you like. We're marching towards the second essay in Nietzsche's Thoughts Out of Season, as it's in one translation. I'm going to make, first of all, something quite extraneous, but I believe it will live within this inquiry into what philosophy is, which we're carrying out by going into Nietzsche's second essay, and for the sake of the stuff that we can find there so far as its philosophy. I think of Nietzsche's comments on Lessing, who he says came to the conclusion that all we can do is seek truth. That's a funny thing. I don't know. Maybe that's the highest thing. Perpetually seeking truth. It could be fulfilling. But it also sounds terrible. So let me give this example out of recent history as best as I can. And the example I want to give is the recent conflict between the Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine is the recent coinage. The term is only a few hundred years old. Until the fall of the Soviet Union, nobody made this distinction between the Ukrainians and the Russians in any strong way, not even as an ethnicity. And it was taken for granted that the borders would be open, that work would remain open through the borders. But of late, we have all kinds of talk about Russian aggression against the Ukrainians, as though they are totally different people. And so how can they suddenly be different culturally? Even Vladimir Putin now, as though in a concession to the general opinion, is admitted that Ukrainians have some cultural differences. Of course, within the whole Russian sphere, there's all kinds of cultural differences. I'm told in the north there's a great Viking influence on the habits of the people, and there's all kinds of local influences. And I believe that at the end of the Soviet Union, there's as many as 15 different groups were broken apart, and the Ukrainians are one of them. The Ukrainians are a special one of them because the Kievan Rus was, in a way, the earthsprung of the Russians. And if you think about it in 19th century terms, you have this notion of the, I think they call it Mala Russia, or Mala Rus, and the small Russia is Ukraine, but that's a geographer's technical term. So what they mean by that is this is the authentic core of Rus, and the outside core is just the Duke of Muscovy and his realms. This connection to the third, and it's perhaps it shouldn't be stated this way, but after all, the Duke of Muscovy is the source of this inflow of the so-called Third Rome, the Byzantine Christianity. And it's a very strange and storied history, and it involves the Byzantine princess, and it has something to do with the Italian Renaissance coming to Moscow. And I'm told that even the Kremlin is modeled after this Italian Renaissance influence, and there's a whole Cherchez la femme theme. I know that that's a phrase that Putin has used in public on several occasions. The princess, it means look to the woman if you want to know what's happening, the source of these things. But that doesn't go for the Ukrainian-Russian issue unless you say Ursula von der Leyen, Roach, and this German woman that's at the head of the current European Union is exercising some nefarious force over the whole thing. Maybe she is in some sense. You could say, other people say the CIA is agitated in Ukraine. Other people give the rationale of the general population wants to go into the Eurozone and think this will be to their economic advantage to do so. There's other that there's a small Catholic population that's elite in Ukraine, and they've taken over the government. That the governing elites that are in power for other reasons want to break off, and so there's a whole sorted array of versicolor explanations for this living, changing explanations for this whole issue. But putting that aside, there is an issue where there wasn't. So this is analogous, and it's both analogous and it's part of this rise of this so-called historical consciousness. The historical consciousness can be given in terms of philosophic doctrines, in terms of the rise out of Leo Strauss says Kant raised his head at the gate of history, but he didn't get there, so Hegel and others after him brought us into historicism. Hegel and Marx in particular. But there's another way that historicism comes through, and that's in terms of this rise of this general sense of the availability, this Überhaupt, this Overstock, this Gestell, they're simply available to past. And you have a will to some current projects. Say somebody has a will to Ukrainian juridical nationalism. Everybody who holds a Ukrainian passport has a special status, something like whatever. But somebody has a will to a project, and history is washing over them. New opportunities are coming to their eyes all the time, and it's not that they, in a vulgar way, simply say do historical revisionism in the sense of inventing things, but rather it's available there. There are cultural differences. Then you emphasize it, you bring it out, and you make it more urgent. There are, if you like, biological, ethnic differences. Maybe there's differences in appearance in some sense, etc. So you could bring all these things forward. This is not exactly the problem Nietzsche raises in this second essay of this book, the Thoughts Out of Season, but it's linked to it. And there's a question that Nietzsche raises primarily is of the motive. We'll go into the motive of who's ever doing any willing activity, but in this case the will is towards deciding what is important in the past in order to prop up the current project, the current, and this has happened all along, and you can point out now that that people have always chosen things that they think is important. And one crude example is that the Americans think they won World War II, the Russians think they won World War II, things like that, and and you think it's important to promulgate this message to the youth or whatever it is. That's a very crude example. It happens in a whole array of ways. I mean, for example, who won the Battle of Waterloo, which general, and you get different answers from the French, from the Germans, from the Belgians, etc., from the Americans, from the Russians, etc., etc. And in other words, it doesn't have to be delivered. It can be just the way it seems to be, and then there's this problem in distinguishing the fact from what simply seems to be, just as we get in any daily interaction when somebody has to recount events. But this can be made into a science and exploited and become a kind of technology of seduction and control and willing propaganda, as it were, because once people think they know something, they like to hear it repeated quite often. Well, I throw that in, and maybe that's not completely true, but that's a little bit of a nasty way to put it. But in any case, we have this. I want to go into the idea that there's the historical consciousness is growing. And I want this exurgue, as it was, that's the word Jacques Derrida used, exurgue, and he liked it. It has something to do with the name on the writing on the outside of the edge of the coin, or so, sort of the frontier of the coin. But he liked it because etymologically it links to the ergon, to the idea of this Greek idea of a work, which has this sort of mysterious role in Heidegger. But let's say here, the work doesn't mean the labor, something like that. What it means is something that's working on us because it's alive. So this whole example should be working on us, being alive during the rest of the inquiry.